So thank you for the nice introduction and welcome to the lecture. You see the first picture already, and that is actually a picture taken when I was a student, just about graduating. So what you're going to see in this lecture is kind of my change in the last 25 years or so, from your age to mine. So what you see here is, well, it's a man on a donkey, but basically I ask myself at my end of the studies, what am I actually as an architect? What am I doing? You know, what is my role, or what is architecture, or what do I do? And I try to represent this in a picture. And that is the proposal for this understanding of myself. And the idea of this is that architecture is, in a strange way, a double perception or a double perspective. On one hand, it's the perspective between, you know, this guy and the carrot. So it's kind of when you're designing a project, you try to produce something, an interesting system or an interesting complexity. And at the same time, you look at that work from outside. And I think quite often when I look from outside, I have to laugh a bit about this guy inside. You know, it's almost a bit stupid or banal or strange. But I still think this actually kind of this double perspective, trying to do at that time, this system that works in itself, and at the same time, this perception from outside, this I understood as the core of my role at that time. So this led to projects like this, and this is a student work that I made in my last semester. And we were asked to design an architecture office for ourselves and how we would imagine our lives. So that's already the final project. And I will explain it. So it's in a garden somewhere in Zurich. It's a 3-story building above ground and one below ground, and it has a core in the center with some stairs. Now, imagine you will be my people working in my office. You would come through this path, say hello to the secretary, walk around, and take up these stairs. Basically, you come in here, you walk up in the first floor, and you find your place, your table in the first floor. Now, if I would come, I would also walk in, say hello, but I would take these stairs. And my stairs is blind to the floor where the workers are, so they don't see me and they don't see the condition I'm in. I just go through them to the top floor. And I'll arrive in this little foyer space, and I enter into my small office all alone. And I have a little library and a little desk. And of course, with these stairs, I could go down to the drafts space. So from here, from the draft space, you could take these stairs and, it would be these stairs in plan, huh? And then either come to my office to talk with me, or I could go here and we could meet the window person that is still waiting on this seat to come and meet in this meeting room, huh? And if you look at the structure of the building, it has a core holding the 2 stairs, and then it has 4 cantilevering walls. And these walls hold a roof, and since the span is so long, it increases the structural height in the middle. and this plate is hung on the cantilevering walls, it would have a tendency to bend through. So in order to not bend through, it's pulled up. So this is actually not a pillar on compression, but on traction. And the same is with this plate. Twice it's held on a traction cable, and only in the middle it's actually a pillar on compression. But in order that you cannot see this, or you do not feel it, or you cannot understand the system, this traction cable is formulated as a pillar on compression. So it's also a 20 times 20 centimeter pillar. So it's a first trial to mislead your reading of the building. The next thing is spatially, I think we have kind of a overlapping of the three principal buildings, spaces in architecture. The first is when the pillars are in the middle, so kind of like the Noguchi lamp or 50 times 50 building by Mies. The pillars are in the middle and not in the corners, and as a consequence, kind of the space is, the inner space is not defined, and the space can just flow through. While in the working space where I want people to work, they are contained. And on the top floor, there is this space that has a strong back and a direction to, an opening and a direction to one side. And so when it comes to the reading of this building, I think it's interesting because it overlaps several connotations or readings. One could read it as a kind of Greek temple because of the tripartition, because of the roof, which is actually structural. But it could also look like a maison domino with the plates and the pillars. But when you read it longer, you realize actually it cannot be because the pillars don't go through. So I would argue that this building has a lot of memory, but none of the memory bring you to a conclusion. You're always lost. So it's a constant trying to make people being interested to look at it, but at the same time, it does not, you don't get to an end. Good, and next project I would like to show you is the house in Balstal. This is a little house in a valley in Switzerland, in the mountains. And this place is a very beautiful place, but also a very boring place. So I imagined the house should be so good that you could stay 2 weeks in the house without exiting it. Then I built it. And the proposal to what this building does is kind of a machine to perceive the exterior in 3 different ways. And these 3 different ways are simply stapled on top of each other. So the first space is when you enter this space here. And this is a space that is completely glazed, very low. And I would say, and no back as a consequence, because it's all glazed. You never have a back wall. And I would say this is just kind of a hole in the entire territory. And eventually even the center of this space is not even here, but here where all the water in this valley meets. So it's a space, I would say, where you just have there's only presence, and it's almost like an animal, I imagined. You're in there and you just look what's around, so you're not kind of attacked, or it's a very physical space. The next space is the space above. It's, I would say, very oppositional. It's not low, but it's actually very high. It's a contained space. And it's a space that I would say it's the most rational, almost kind of in a military way, strategic way, so a very artificial way to produce space by simply, you will see later, making two separation walls. So, and maybe the next aspect is in this space, you always look at nature in a frame, through a frame. So it's always a vis-a-vis connection. So it's almost like in a museum, how you look at the painting or how you look at a landscape, or you're not part of it, you just look at it. And then the third part is below ground, which has absolutely no more physical connection to the surrounding. It only has a skylight, and it's a kind of a daydream space where you could imagine you're luckily also once not in Balstal, but maybe in Philadelphia. So let's make a quick tour in this building. You come in, you go below ground, no pillars in the middle, and basically the stairs and structure is just a result actually from the upper part. It's slightly sunken into the ground. You have these moving panels to make an office or bookshelves, and exactly that's how it works. And here is a kitchen actually, so the kitchen is also continuous, but it's normally a bit higher. There's a step going down. This is the exit into the garden. This is the kitchen. And now we're upstairs. So the oppositional space, the high space, it's in the simplest way divided by 4 plus a stairs. It's the smallest way to produce an entry into these 4 floors. And what I mean, this round window, that's kind of quite important in this project. And it started because when you imagine a building with a gable like this, it's very easy to open this side with glazing, but it's very difficult to open here, especially because in reality there are 2 pillars below, so it's really the worst place to punctuate it. But in order to produce a balance between this direction and this direction, I proposed this huge circle that has such an emotional power that it's kind of able to balance or to compete with these 2 sides, so they become kind of equal. And what I realized after construction only, it's a very nice place to be here, and I think it's because you have 4 scales at the same time. So one scale is kind of the nails and the stuff, this material stuff that you see. The second one is the scale of the person, because this circle is kind of the size of a person. Then the third scale is the huge space, I mean the inside space, and the fourth space is the flat landscape, and this happens at the same time. So now we go from the top room to the basement, which is this one, and this space looks like this. Good. The next project we'd like to show is a house in Bonassola. It's in Italy, a very beautiful area at the lake, at the sea. And when going through this land, I realized that mostly the old buildings are very beautiful and the new ones are very ugly. And I kind of asked myself why. And in a very simple way, I would say these new ones, they just don't get the patina in a nice way. The plaster is out of plastic. They just don't manage to get nicely old. They don't get nicely old. So I thought, let's do a building that from the beginning looks extremely old, like a ruin already, like it was already over. So I started with a section, and this section, before knowing actually the space, and because the idea was, how can I get all the little details away so that I don't see things that indicate time, so like the electric plugs or the frames of a window. And this is the proposal for the windows. Then I propose to take this insulation concrete, so you don't see any any different materials in the inside. And it's a very small house. It's this little thing that I had to rebuild, and it took me, by the way, I think like 18 years until it's been built. Now it's finished, and it's the first pictures of this house. It's a very beautiful view, and this is actually how this building looks. So you arrive from this upper part, see down into the sea, go down into these steps, and enter from the steps into a little garden. And from this garden, you come into a main space and some additional rooms. And this main space is divided kind of in two rooms. One room is a winter and summer room, which has no windows, and the other one is the in-between room, so spring and autumn. And in the autumn room, we have kind of it's a Zentralraum, like a central space with 4 openings, while the winter and summer space has no walls, but a little zenithal wall. And I always like this idea to be in one space, for example here, and at the same time you're also in its opposite, and you kind of see both, but are in one. I like this double existing of things. From here, this may be an interesting, or, I needed some place to sleep. But the building would have been best without any room to sleep, because now it's completed. It's kind of a perfect rectangle. And I tried to find a strategy to add a room without that you don't see it somehow. So what I propose is to do a stairs that actually starts 5 steps before we meet the wall. So we're already 5 steps down, which means 5 times 20 centimeters, it's like 1 meter down. And as a consequence, this opening is not 2 meters high, but only 1 meter. And in this concrete, this almost is perceived like a chimney or something, this size. It does not remember you of a door, but for example, of a chimney. So you take these stairs, and you're down, and there's a little bedroom. These are section, facade. This was a model, how I imagined. So it's a space that kind of has no age. It's already a ruin. Construction plan, you see there is only this concrete. This is how we built it. Therefore, I wanted to imagine, this is another aspect, it's on a slope. And as you can never see at this building like as an object, you never have a distance to see the full building. The building is always like 1 meter in front of you, because, I mean, this is now a construction site, but here it will immediately go down. So you're always along this wall when you walk around it. And what I wanted is that this wall becomes very, almost like Baroque, but in a contemporary way. So I tried to do the ugliest construction I can. So we took this Roman way of pouring concrete, of making this slab. So there is no of this metallic binder to make it tight. And all these boards are not tight. So the concrete milk will always exit and it will be full of holes. And like that, I hoped that when I'm close to this building, it's full of man traces, of man-made traces. And you also see in construction, it indeed leaks out everywhere. And it also has this physical proximity of concrete and trees. And yeah, here are some first already pictures of how it now looks. Sorry, doesn't end. Yeah, don't talk about this. Okay. No, I mean, maybe I do. When you are there, it's interesting. You have proximity, close stuff, walls and bricks, but you also have this universe and this huge sky and this huge sea. So you have these two complete different scales, the proximity and the wideness. And I always thought it needs something that responds to this wideness. And the proposal now is that somehow this circle with this cut can kind of, in an esoteric way, can almost start to communicate with the sky and with the wideness. So it's this antenna or this simple thing that can connect with the sky or with the sea. Good. And next project is House in Harris, House on an Island. And this project is based basically on the condition of this area. And the condition is it has no trees, it only has water and rocks. So I tried to do a building that is able to confront the idea of water and the idea of rock. And I basically propose two spaces, and the space that is in front of the water shall symbolize or shall be able to capture this hugeness of the sea, this endlessness of the sea. And of course, a building is always so small, it's difficult to make a space as big as the sea. So what I propose is to do the most abstract space that I can imagine. And the proposal is a round space as an abstraction. It's somehow this most simple and abstract way, divided by 2, which I think is only kind of possible in a mathematical way, but it's difficult to imagine a half of a circle spatially. And the other space is just a very large circle that manages to frame the rocks. And that's the conclusion. That's how the floor plan looks. We have here the space that should be able to confront the sea. And here, as a fragment of this whole, it's the space that activates the rocks. Good. Then another quick building that we built is in Zurich, is a little hut. That's a place like a kindergarten or something. A circular building out timber. It's again based on this idea of Ballstahl to make the outside very present by going down slightly and being fully glazed, and a second space hovering above this beautiful park. And I'll not talk so much about this, that's how it looks. This are these school rooms. Good. And then lately, or already some years ago, I thought that this picture of the donkey was kind of over. You know, it doesn't it doesn't represent anymore my time. So I was asked, or I thought for a next publication, I make a new picture. And that's the proposal for this picture. It was actually based on a lecture that I had on reuse. And I think what principally changed is this idea to be able to control things. And far more today, I have the impression it's just trying to censor things and in a certain way participating with them or flowing with them, and their stuff is contradictory and it's oppositional, and kind of identity is almost vanishing. I think in this movie that you probably all know, this one lady that has several persona, I think represents this state of identity very strongly. I think also new becomes this idea that stuff with a second life eventually is almost more precious than stuff that has a first use. I find also the first time I heard of these rockets that can actually not only fly away but land. That's a real new way to understand our physical or my physical reality. Of course, we know it from the past. I also think, for example, this pool by Caesar is also about this topic. You know, stuff is unprecise, and it's here this rock and the man-made rock, and its stuff is just no more precise. It interconnects or so. And I was asked to enter this this little project. At that time, I thought, would it be possible to produce a construction or an object or something to expose that makes you happy by looking at it, but it should not, you should not have any memories. You know, can you look at something, feel happiness, and it's not connotated, it's not a memory based. And actually I asked my father, which is a psychologist, what they think, and then he says, well, as far as I know, happiness is always correlated to memory. Unless you do electrostimulation in your brain, or you eat drugs. But nevertheless, I thought it could be interesting to just try, you know, to give it a try. What could produce this? And in a very principled manner, I realized what I think is what makes joy to me is to simply put stuff on top of each other. I think it's a very primal feeling of myself by just putting something on top of each other. So that was one aspect. And the other aspect was just like senses. something, it's nice to touch, maybe something soft, or it's eventually beautiful to look at some strong colors or so. And this is the result of it. We made this kind of things that were put on top of each other that I think was actually almost better here than what we did in the end. But we had only one try, because in the second try we tried to give it a texture again that is just nice and fine, and yeah, somehow give these colors of ice cream. And I agree, it's kind of a memory already. It's this strong colors, but the blue, I don't know this blue ice cream. So it's a bit of going away from the ice cream, and that is the final proposal. The client in Harris suddenly said, look, I'm sorry, it was the wrong place for your proposal. It's like a mile on the other side. Please do another proposal. And so I make a second version. And same landscape, but this time very different project. So there is no more clear rules, and architecture just becomes a kind of procedure to walk from different spaces to different spaces. Also, the model, there is no more gross or general idea. Also in section, and also in the perception. Similar was the house in Tommy. That was a little, he's really very small, a farmer next to the house in Balstal. He asked me to do a building with 3 rooms. One is to eat, one is to sleep, and one is a bathroom. And oh la la, we don't see a lot, huh? Ah, there it's much better. Hello, here on this side. No. So it's a building, the whole thing. Oh, now it's, oh no, I stay here. It's one rectangular, and it's one wall that divides this space in 3 places. So eating, bedroom, and bathroom. And in section, it goes slightly up to the forest, and it has this roof towards the street. So actually no more real rules for things. Similar for this house for a doctor in Switzerland, the Lake Gruyère. He has a family with 4 kids, and he likes to, he's a doctor, he operates, and at night he goes home and fixes cars to relax. And that is the floor plan of his building. So you enter the building, and there is a wall that you can either go straight to his car repair place, or a wardrobe, or the 4 children that somehow live in this unordered but huge space, some kind of toilet condition, stairs to go down, and then also down, it has no more clear structuring order, but only, I would say, kind of a temperature or a kind of a taste of space. That's how you enter the building. These are the kind of spaces in here. This I always liked, that there was like a very small way to go to the bedroom that is kind of hidden of it all. Good. Now another topic that came parallel, there was kind of housing that we always did a bit, and this is a housing which is, I mean, it was kind of a study project for the national train company in Switzerland and for the steel people. And it was an idea to, it was actually during COVID, how can you combine living and working, and how can you apply this in a housing? So what I was always interested, or in that time interested, is these spaces that don't have a clear program anymore. So here in this house, Osama from Atelier Bauer, it's kind of not clear what this man does here. You know, is he working, or is that his living room? It's spaces kind of lose their program. And I find also very beautiful in these pictures that exist of Louise Bourgeois' apartment. They are always, you can kind of double read them. It's somehow her living room, but it's also somehow an office or something. It's not really clear what it is, or this is her kitchen and workspace that somehow expands in a funny way, or that's her bed. So it's sleeping, an office, and it's a précaire in French, like it's a precarious, it's no stable conditions. So this was kind of the principal idea, or I mean, of course, Corbu in the past also always made spaces that were functionally multi-programmed, that we all know. And even when we look a bit back into the history, at least of Europe, I mean, usually the bedrooms were in the kitchen because it was just the warmest place. And so this is this housing based on this idea along the train track in Switzerland. And they base kind of typologically on two ideas. There is spaces that are too small, but extremely specific. Like in a car, everything is very precise, and even though it's small, everything has its space. And then there is other spaces, they're kind of too big, but they are programmatically undefined. And there's another principal idea that in Switzerland, usually the bathrooms are in the cores and the sleeping rooms are at the facade. So I thought it would actually make more sense to invert this, because you go and sleep kind of in a very protected place, like almost in a cave, so in the center, but you go and wash yourself at the nature where it's clean and the air goes through. So bathroom goes to periphery and sleeping goes to the central, to the core. This produces then some typologies. So this is kind of this undefined, too big ground floor space. And then you would go up and it would have 4 bedrooms here, very small, and the bathing area in the back. And you could then you could open this bedroom walls, so it becomes part of the space and kids can kind of run around, or you just open the doors like this. Yeah, I will not, then there was also elderly home, new typologies for an elderly home, and also some typologies for student apartments that are extremely cheap by simply making the bedroom very, very small, which I will also not enter, and then a structural system to have a community level on one floor. And I wanted to look this thing like paper. So It's built out of steel. This is a full steel wall. And by the way, this really works according to structure and phonetic and fire problems. I mean, it's really buildable. It's a steel of 2 centimeters. Actually, 1.4 would be enough, but we made it 2. And very thin slabs, which kind of don't work in metal because of fire reasons. But that was kind of the slimmest that we managed. And that's how it looks in section. And it's a section into the other direction. And this is a facade. So it looks like kind of a paper model that is built in big. Then maybe the last project is the one that you mentioned. This is another housing project in Switzerland, Hobelwerk, for a Genossenschaft, like cooperative, or like building cooperative or something. So, and the idea of this is to have a lot of rooms, and they share kind of the communal spaces. So it's a 16-room apartment. It's here on this old industrial place, and maybe just to show you what these people wanted, which I find is interesting. They wanted to be very cheap and to be very ecological, and then that working and living is together, then this huge apartment, and then sufficience. So trying to minimize the square meters per person, because actually in Switzerland, this grew and grew and grew over the years, and no wonder apartments get more expensive and we use more and more space, because simply in Switzerland, within the last 40 years, the space per person doubled. So we try to shrink it. And then, of course, there is this workshop where actually the future inhabitants already participated in the design. So that's a section. Maybe I didn't explain this here. Yes, it's 4 floors. And again, in Switzerland, it's actually a very big topic to reduce the production of CO2. So we try to do buildings without concrete, basically. And it goes so far that we also try to stop to do any undergrounds. So it's just a plate and then a timber construction that I will explain a bit more. Also on typologies, I find interesting. It has some new research. This is the ground floor. So for example, these 4 individual units, they share together one large space. So for example, 4 architects, they have their little apartments, and together they have one office space. Or a bit more traditional, somebody's living here and having like an atelier to the front. In the upper part, there are these rooms, individual rooms, some toilets, and then all this becomes kind of a landscape of living rooms. And because they put their living rooms all together, just the amount of square meters shrinks that they use. And on the roofs, we propose this place for wild bees, because the diversity of wild bees, the bees that actually pollinate the flowers, decreases heavily. So this is exclusively a roof, especially for wild bees. And in this whole project, we try to reduce all the asphalt, so the water can always go straight into the ground to re-evaporate in summer. And of course, basically fill it with plants as much as possible to produce shadows. In terms of producing it, I mean, when we then really started to build it, was interesting. So on one hand, we made this wooden construction that is also optimized on CO2, which was done actually when we asked the builders for their prices. We also asked them how many CO2 are you going to produce with the construction. So how long will your paths be to deliver, where is your wood coming from, and so on. And it was seriously used as one reason to choose them. The other thing was to reuse the building elements, and ohne Sonderstatus means it was not allowed to be more expensive, because it's quite easy to reuse, but it's very difficult actually to keep the low costs. Yeah, and then some other new things are that the airs, I mean, this is controlled air, but the air is not done on a time loop or on temperature, but on the amount of CO2 in the air. And so it's the CO2 in the air that regulates if the machine runs and not the temperature. And the fourth, also interesting, we have energy peaks when we need a lot of energy, just when you run a building. And we tried to find ways to put these peaks, and to flatten these peaks, but I will not enter it now too much on this. Another thing that I thought was interesting is when we asked the wood construction to bid prices, we did not define the materials. We only defined the final spaces. So it's kind of a functional subscription or something. So it was the wooden guy that would then propose actually how to build it. And also, since it was done with reused, we told them, look, we don't know yet how big the windows are, or we don't know how big the doors are. So there were always these green areas which were unclear. So this is, for example, how we then had a look which client got the job based on this CO2. Also, we tried to eliminate every surfaces that is not really needed. So it's kind of a Edelrohbau, like a nice primary construction. And as a consequence, you see a lot of kind of unfinished, at least for Swiss standards, unfinished materials. Also very interesting would almost be a lecture. How do you organize the client, the architect, and the producer by reusing things? Because you imagine we reuse an old window, and the problem is nobody can guarantee that this window works. And this happens with all the elements. And contracts are usually based on the idea that you deliver something and you guarantee the quality, but it has a specific price. And what do you do if you cannot guarantee the quality anymore? The whole system of contracts has to actually be reinvented. And yeah, this was kind of in the beginning when we started. The major work was to find out new control system between client and architect, how to make this work. I will not, enter it now, but I think actually that's probably the biggest problem why it's difficult to build with reused elements, because nobody takes warranties. Principally, how we did it in the end, we tried to build it as simple as possible. And we simply said, we defined like 15 or 20 elements that we went out on the market or in the street searching reused elements. And if we found out they were cheaper than building new, we would build it. So we had kind of a backup. Yeah, I will not enter too much to it. So, for example, we found these windows. This was a building that they demolished. So we took these windows and these shutters, um, took them out, wrapped them. Or this is a mock-up, from another building where they built this one-to-one. So all the mock-ups we found in the area we took because we knew it was quite good chance that there's a good quality. Also very simple. That's actually the easiest element, build construction element, is this metallic facade is very easy to reuse. We thought old doors is very easy because they are always the same. We found out actually we had like 200 of those doors from an old bank that we reused. We found out that actually each door had a different size. We measured 2 or 3, but realized it's not at all the same. Exactly, or this plate we used in the garden, but interesting, they're too slippery, of course, you fall, so they're turned, so they're upside down. We took actually the other side, where they lost all elegance. Yeah, and this is, let's say, these are some of the elements that you see that we reused. That's already how it looks. I mean, what we did was, in order to produce a certain harmony, or we proposed to paint everything in white. Whatever we get, we take everything we can, but we paint it in white. Here you see the old window and then rebuilt window. Or I find also quite interesting that 80% of the windows are reused and 20 are new. And it's kind of beautiful when new windows and old collide just next to each other. Or here also, this kind of old 90s door is suddenly refound here. Or of course the metal, very easy to use. Boards for the ground. That's this window, this mock-up window, the doors. And this is, find also an interesting aspect. This is this gutter here to not fall down. It's actually from a bed from the prison of Zurich. It's this thing. So suddenly buildings have a very funny history or memory, actually. That's how this prison balcony looks. Yeah, these are some of the reused elements and where they're from. It's at the moment in Switzerland the building with the lowest CO2 in production that was ever built. And also in running, it's basically zero because there is no burning. And of course, actually, it's quite clear why it's so little. It's because we have very little concrete. We have this timber. And on top, which is kind of new, these reused elements. And this combination makes it, this low usage. This is how it looks. And this is kind of interesting because in the end, it looks like a very normal apartment. It's almost lost. It's this reuse idea. And also what I find, or it was one of the learnings, is all elements that are reused have a very high value. They're usually very good elements because since they were good, we could reuse them. And all the new bought stuff is very cheap stuff. So actually, when you go in this building, the old stuff is you feel the quality, and the new is just trash, which I never thought of it in the beginning. Huh? Good, good, good. then I think one last project that you mentioned that we are interested is kind of large buildings that we start to plan, this hospital or this university. And what I am very much interested is how can we make buildings that have a strong, kind of a strong connection to the outside, or in a certain way that the public space, it's also the topic of our studio, how is the public space connected to the inhabitants? And I think this training place here in Brazil is probably one of the best public spaces I can imagine, because it's completely embedded. It has a very clear center where they work, but also it's very elegant, I think, because the energy they need to make it is very simple. And it has a very strong identity. So in a certain way, this for me will be the perfect university. And I think it goes together with ideas like this swimming pool where the borders are blurred, or also in a certain way this Sao Paulo train station where stuff only has a center, but it expands to infinite. It has no more clear edge, but it has a center. And as a consequence, this is the sketch of this university. So it's just this landscape that goes in and continues in this building. It has kind of a core, and it's also actually inverted university. So in the blue is the rooms where the students have, or where there are the confined rooms. And in the outside, it's all the walking areas and the meeting areas and the cafes and the restaurants and the study places. So it's actually the opposite of this. These are kind of the sections. So you see it's woven into the space, and these are the floor plans. Where you feel this is the core with the classrooms, and then these learning spaces are connected to the outside. Now that's how it looks. Also timber, and this, I think that was it. That was it. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I can ask a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, first, thank you. It was a fantastic lecture. Even more than the work, and my question was actually oddly maybe not about the work, but even more than the work, what I appreciated was the performance of the lecture as well. And it sounds like it is a serious question, but maybe an unserious topic, but I'd love to hear you elaborate about how you develop some of these techniques, or if they're just the way that you think about and share your work. I mean, the things that come to mind, the Renaissance paintings of naked figures behind plans, but then not mentioning anything about that, like walking towards the screens and facing the screen more than the audience, like always saying good after the end of the project. These are things that I feel like are actually very important for how we talk about work, and it's not always said. And we just had interviews today with students, and sharing, encouraging them to think about how they share their work is very important. So I'm curious to hear you know, how you have developed the way that you tell the stories of your project, and you know, how much of that is engineered versus just, you know, innate to your personality.
Yeah. Well, principally, I think the problem of an architect is to have the energy to continue working. I mean, I need some intrinsic, I mean, this work I find as an architect is so tough and so often so frustrating that I have the impression if you don't have inner motivation, it's difficult. And so that's the principle why I kind of constantly also try to eventually change or find out what I could be interested or so. It's a kind of a principle search that is eventually not even so much about the architecture or the outcome, but eventually more about myself to survive or to have joy. And in a certain way, these are then just the results. That's one level. The other level is, that's why I mentioned the two pictures with a donkey and then later with this figure. So I think there's quite a fundamental change from in a certain way, outside perspective on architecture in the first part. You know, what it should do, and it was a kind of quite abstract way. It was kind of a distant performing, you know, this quite well designed office, but in a certain way also very distant. And I think the main thing that changed in the second part is that I'm much more the center. And there is no more dogma or something, or as I said, it's just more like trying to feel or understand what could be interesting in a building. And of course, I also had to sadly or realize that it's difficult to tell the client to obey you, you know, to I mean, it's just very difficult to say you need to do a square, you know, otherwise it doesn't work. No, I mean, to have like outside principles. So that's also a principle understanding that probably the only way to make what I found out interesting architecture was to really understand the client and the brief and the condition, to also really understand kind of where I find joy and how I combine this. And that I think makes also all projects very different. I have to strongly adapt to kind of the client's need and still find an open door or one aspect that I'm interested in. And probably that makes, and I also see it, the work starts to get, the way that it looks or feels starts to lose a bit, in my understanding, a bit the rigidity or the identity, because I have to kind of adapt to these situations. And then, I mean, this other aspect, yes, honestly, quite often stuff starts without that I understand what I do. For example, with the naked women, I made, this was kind of the first project that has no very clear strategy. You know, the buildings before, they were all some kind of systematic ways to explain it and to develop it. And this was the first building that did not have this story. And I remember I was then in my office and I had to go to a lecture, and I thought, these people will not like my project because I cannot explain it. And I thought, they're gonna be bored. How could I make that I don't fall asleep? And then this idea of overlapping, maybe naked women, I thought maybe this will make them awake. And I indeed started to do plans and put naked women, and I put like 50 very different kind of painters, motifs, and for a funny way, this is a painter from early 19th century from Switzerland, which I find actually not very good. It's Valentin. But I cannot say why, but I think together with these plants, I find it works very well. And later I found out one way to kind of keep curiosity myself, but also to the outside, is exactly this strategy that you describe. So you make one thing going, but you don't describe it, but you do something else, and this thing is constantly blinking. You know, it's making this urge, and I think we also try to do it in the studio with our works. It's actually very manipulative. It's trying to imagine. It's a bit like a studio director in a movie. We think a lot, or I try to think a lot about how will the visitors perceive the building or a lecture or a presentation. And of course, I think this double motif is a very good way to capture presence, because they wanna get it, but you slightly go around it. So yes, it's a strategy I'm aware of, and I find it good. And also I have to say, sometimes stuff is so good you don't need stories. I find, for example, the donkey, I find a very strong picture, and I can explain it the way it happens. It doesn't need a story. And other stuff sometimes need a bit of a story, so it's adapted, or it's according to the project. Does that answer a bit?
That was great.
Okay.
There's another one.
Thank you, Pascal. That was excellent. In response a little bit to the first question, I'll put on the table that surrealists are French and the Dadaists are German.
And I'm between.
Yeah, somewhere between those two, maybe that might answer the first question. But when you were discussing placing things in tension,
Yeah.
the very last moment when you were talking about having the brief and then potentially subverting the brief or re-understanding the brief, I thought it was really compelling when you showed the project, the Winter project, and you described all of the material opportunities for decarbonizing. I was really taken, and I hope some of the students heard it really clearly when you described that the selection of the contractors was also based on those that could come to the space by decarbonizing their own actions. And then the mapping that you made, that you said was very complicated, but I'm sure filled with a lot of information about how you change your decision making based on this question of decarbonization, so we're self-reflecting on ourselves. So one of the things you didn't speak about, which I'd love if you could say a bit more, is that when you reuse, you have to change the contracts because of the warranty, but you might also change the notion of labor and who actually works and embodies the project. So could you say a little bit about whether it did or did not change who worked on the project, who labored, who built it, because you were using different kinds of materials and also reused materials? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, principally, this was the first reuse project in Switzerland without trying to not be more expensive than yeah. And this already made the selection of participants very small, because most planners knew, no way, I'm not going to participate in this. I'm only going to burn my hands. I'm going to lose money on this thing, because there is no clear procedure how to go through this thing, and it means I lose money. So I would say principally that already made the selection of who joined almost kind of personally or politically reasons why those companies participated, because they all want to find a new way to do this. So I would say all participants lost money on this thing, but also learned a lot. And so these are all idealistic people in a certain way that participated. That's one string. Another string is that in Switzerland, this is now so strong. You know, it's even, it now also goes into legislation. For example, it's almost impossible anymore to use concrete in Switzerland, just because you have to show the amount of CO2 you have, and concrete is just out for all buildings. And on the level of public buildings, there is now in the new legislation a specific amount of reused elements that must be built in the thing. I think at the moment it's 10%. So they say 10%, but then it's always a question of all materials or of the costs or of the volume or whatever. But let's say just 10% of the volume must be built in reuse. So a lot of entrepreneurs know that that is simply the direction that goes. So they must enter this way, even though it's not very comfortable in it. So there is some want and some have to, in a certain way, enter this field. And I would say also the client, I have to say this client is a very, I mean, it's a very left-wing client that wants to do this project as an ideologist. Actually, it was also very interesting. Some parts of the client was what we called green, so kind of ecologists interested, and some were interested in cheap housing. And it's interesting, of course, that they don't match anymore. In the past, these were kind of two, the green and left would be the similar interests, but in reuse, this is separate people, which is actually, I find quite interesting. Quite often, and I also realize it, for example, a big topic in Switzerland is densification of the center in order as an opposition of urban sprawl. And it's very interesting that the very left and the very right politically suddenly start to have a similar interest in this topic. And somehow politically is quite similar with reuse. I mean, the ones that want to reuse are green, what we would say green, and the ones that just want cheap are suddenly very close to the right-wing parties. So, yeah, this I find very complex or a new condition, interesting new condition. Then, just as a very principle, maybe also to say our contracts in Switzerland are always the honoraries of each participant is based on the costs of the building. And as soon as we have reused elements which have no price or not a clear price, this is one principal aspect where this whole also way to measure the amount of work you do just collapses. And I think actually the only way that is possible is starting to find a new way of trusting each other and a new way of sharing work together. The old method in Switzerland, just on the price, just doesn't work anymore. And the second huge topic is this question of liability, guaranteeing stuff. I just think we enter now an era where we can only guarantee together as a society, as an entire group, and we have to start to share risks together and say, look, okay, we take this risk or we don't take it. But the idea to produce, to tell who is guilty and then to find this person. I think with this mentality, we don't get further to build, or we cannot start to enter this new way of construction. And of course, it has to, there's two more very important guys. The cities that gives the okay for the building permit, they have to say yes for a thing they don't know how it looks, which is also new. And the ones that do the norms, so you have quite strong energetic labels on these buildings. Even this we cannot really guarantee anymore because we don't know how good the windows really are, or that, you know, like, so we're lost in many, many ways to this idea of construction that says we set the standard and we have to achieve this standard and then we paid for it, because the standard is no more clear. We don't know the standard anymore. Yeah.
Seems to be an interesting contrast between the first part and the second part of the lecture. It's still like a Hitchcock movie version. The second part, you miss the whole point. The first part seems to be kind of a logical continuation of the legacy of objective. So the non-referential architecture. And as you said, some buildings are boring intentionally. But then we come to the second part, and the idea of using materials, reusing parts. First of all, is it even possible to use materials in a non-referential way? And especially if you're reusing parts. Now the question is, are you trying to reconcile the first part and the second part, or maintain that creative tension between?
Yeah, I mean, you want the honest answer or the invented answer? The honest answer is it's quite suffering to go through, to build a building that I find not only, I lose control, and the parts that I see I find actively not nice. You know, when I look at this building in Winterthur, I always thought, what an ugly building. I mean, when I saw the reuse, because at one moment I start to see what kind of windows and stuff, and I kind of planned it with, for example, with a horizontal band windows, and then it has this, these windows of my grandmother's house. It's not, I mean, I suffered a lot, but as an architect, or in my role, I also had no choice. I need to earn money, I have to go run the thing, I have to go to the client and say, yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, so the honest answer is, I cannot steer this. I would love to control it better and say, wow, look, it's a new fantastic aesthetic and it's much cooler than if I would have controlled anything. Yes, I would like to. But the reality is, and that's also, I experience more and more the reality, I have to let go of this interest of hoping stuff will be in a certain way. This anticipation of stuff, I think it just makes me depressed and sad. So in a certain way, I have to find new ways of motivation or cool stuff. And of course, cool stuff is that it's reused, that it looks in a way that I don't know, that it's funny, that it produced new layers of histories. It's, in a certain way, it's trying to produce a new connection between the built work and my hopes or wishes. So this has, yes, these connections have to be rewired in a certain way. Yeah. But then I still think actually now even more that to accept that buildings to a certain level are proposals that sometimes fail or sometimes produce new aspects. I actually also think that's also our new condition of society. We cannot anymore, this idea of having a wish and then it must be exactly like this, otherwise we're sad. This time is just over. I think to survive, we have to get rid of expectations to a certain way, or we have to find new expectations that are not bound to, as architect, to kind of visual hopes. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I asked about the first half because I'm really fascinated about your form and making and your storytelling about those interiors and how those link with the exterior. And my question is, does the explicit classification of different meanings like concepts and like space destroy the real experience of that space?
Wait, there's a contradiction between the experience space and
the concept. So when this get material, when the concept architecturally get materialized in the physical space, do you think that's kind of
somehow the difference between what I imagined and what I then really see when it's built?
Yeah, like the experience of the space. Because when you're talking about the apartment, you remember how that space has ambiguity. It's not like differentiated. It's programs and models of real functions. That's kind of the experience.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not totally sure if I understood completely what you were saying, but it's kind of, it's in the first phase and in the second phase, if this can be separated so easily, it was very, very different. So in the first phase, I tried to have this control. And I also have to say, like this house in Balstal, so the first timber house was actually very close to what I experienced, how it was in the end and how I imagined it. But probably also just because I made so many pictures and controlled it so strongly, and indeed it was very similar. And then in the next part, in the later part, I completely, as you say, I kind of lost this control. But also quite often just because of economical reasons. There was no money for it, or the client decided himself and I wasn't around, or so yes, this happened, a lot happened. But that's also maybe why I find it important to find new reasons, kind of stronger reasons to do architecture where you're somehow also less fragile, to not be deceived by things you cannot control, or even start to enjoy when stuff is completely different as you thought, which is actually also complicated because in reality, it's the architect that always has to stand there and say, yes, everything is good, everything is under control. That's also the role of an architect, to produce seeming stability in the whole process of construction. So No, it's a difficult condition. Good.
Pascal.